Hey, this is Brian Barletta, and this is Sounds Profitable for Wednesday, November 1st, 2023. Brands in Audio, a new platform for branded podcasts. How big is the branded audio space? What's the best way to find the top production companies, the brands they represent, and what categories are gaining the most traction in the branded podcast space? Brands in Audio is your answer. This week on the Product Deep Dive, Podscribe Head of Growth Amelia Coomber is back with another quick hit. In this 7-minute demo, she shows off the new Ad Placement tab and how it empowers agencies, advertisers, and publishers with visualizations of how, when, and where ads are placed in a given podcast. Available now on soundsprofitable.com. At the IAB podcast upfronts earlier this year, when the podcast advertising industry estimates for 2022 fell $120 million short of the coveted $2 billion predicted, I had one big question. Why aren't we counting branded podcasts? While the advertising side of the industry had a rough Q1, the branded podcast production companies I spoke with were faring much better, renewing additional seasons and working with even more brands. And it wasn't just branded podcast companies finding success. Many production companies known for their own podcasts started expanding into the space or were simply getting more vocal about those opportunities. A fantastic example is the official announcement of Ruby, a branded podcast studio from iHeartMedia, at the very same event. The open nature of podcasting can make it difficult to distinguish content by categories, and especially difficult to identify a show as a branded podcast. There's a substantial number of truly fantastic, award-winning podcasts out there that prefer a more subtle connection to their show over overtly branding it. As a result, identifying branded podcasts, the companies who make them, and their contribution to overall revenue has been a massive blind spot. Which is why today, in partnership with Lower Street, we're incredibly excited to announce the official public launch of Brands in Audio, a collaborative solution built to tackle identification, promotion, and research of a category of podcasting that could have tipped the scales towards the 2022 IAB projections. What is Brands in Audio? Harry Morton, founder of branded podcast company Lower Street, reached out to Tom and I earlier this year about solving a key problem he felt his side of the industry lacked: benchmarks. Benchmarks on defining success, cost of production and marketing, the most competitive categories to be associated with, and a handful of other key metrics to empower the whole branded podcast space while creating an even more compelling argument on why brands should be getting more invested in podcasting. To accomplish this, we built something that provides a home for branded podcasts, where production companies and brands find value in submitting their shows for visibility, and where conversations about the branded podcast space by experts in their field could be held and promoted. That home is Brands in Audio, built to showcase the podcasts, brands, and production companies and give them a platform to collectively speak on branded podcasts. Over the summer, Harry and I had the opportunity to connect with Bryan Keller, who previously led Patreon's Creator Success team, working directly with podcast creators, and may truly be the #1 fan of branded podcasts. Over the past few months, Bryan has reviewed nearly 100 branded podcasts, so bringing Bryan on board as the primary content producer for Brands in Audio and to be an example of thought leadership for other companies to emulate was a no-brainer. We're excited to launch with over 500 podcasts listed in Brand in Audio today, from a combination of self-submitted entries and Bryan's personal database, along with all reviews Bryan has written to date, as the first step in what we believe will give the branded podcast space its own voice and platform. How to participate. You can submit your podcast directly to us through this multi-step form. We built out the tools to allow either party to set their association as public or private, as not all podcasts want those connections defined, but allow us to maintain a record of those relationships for when we move into the research applications for this platform. We also want to encourage all those who submit their podcasts to take things one step further and collaborate with us to build and share thought leadership content from Brands in Audio, further amplifying the opportunity for a branded podcast community. In a few months, after reviewing all the submissions and reaching out to additional production companies and brands for their direct participation, we'll move into the research phase of Brands in Audio. First, collaborating with a large collection of participants to make sure we understand all the questions they want answered, then fielding a questionnaire to the entire database, with the goal of generating more insights and data to propel branded podcasts even further into the spotlight. Most importantly, there's no costs associated with any of this, nor do we intend to explore placing ads on the site. Sounds Profitable will be handling the research side, with Lower Street overseeing the website build and management, along with establishing the original idea, and Bryan Keller reviewing submissions and creating content. and Bryan reviewing submissions and creating captivating content. Wrapping it up, we've been talking an awful lot about branded podcasts lately, and for good reasons. To quote Tom Webster, quote, "So how big is the opportunity here? What is the available audience for podcasts about brands? According to the Power of Brands and Podcasts, it's pretty sizable, a potential reach of 106 million Americans 18 plus, the population of Canada and the UK combined," end quote. And it's not just the listener aspect that motivates this view. Agencies and brands invested in audio are continuing to ask, what's next? We've explored quite a bit with existing podcasts, from the length of an ad to who is reading it and how it's being delivered and measured. Now we're exploring mini segments, limited run series, and full-blown podcast production for many of those same brands. And from another angle, there are many brands with branded podcasts who could be advertising that content in other channels to fully realize their potential. Brands in Audio provides an opportunity to define what a branded podcast is and can be. It creates a central location for a subset of the industry to rally around. Heck, it could even be the starting point for a trade association more befitting of that fine line between production and advertising that other organizations fall short on. Harry, Bryan, Tom, and I all truly hope you find value in this project and choose to participate. We're excited to make 2024 an even stronger year for branded podcasts. Thanks again for listening to my article, Brands in Audio, a new platform for branded podcasts. This episode is hosted on Art19.